Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 32 for History 102. And when we left off last time, we were talking about the Second Red Scare, commonly known as McCarthyism, and the annex of Senator Joe McCarthy and his communist witch hunt. Now, where we want to pick up next is on page 842 in your book, and that's the election of 1948. Now, in this election, Harry S. Truman will be running on his own for the first time. Remember, he took over in 1945 upon FDR's passing, and the Republicans will nominate Thomas Dewey once again to run for a second time. And what is going to make Truman so vulnerable is that Southern Democrats are going to start to split away from the party, and they're going to be rallying around Senator Strom Thurmond from the state of South Carolina. And he's going to run on basically an anti-immigration platform because Truman had desegregated the United States military, which was controversial to, segregationists in America. And that's going to make Truman pretty vulnerable because there's a divide in the Democratic Party. But when all's said and done, Truman is going to pull off what many people believe a major upset. And on 842, you have that famous photograph of Harry S. Truman holding up the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune that they published prematurely, where it says, "Dewey defeats Truman." And obviously he's relishing the moment because he won with about 24 million votes to Dewey's 22 million. And then, the rest was divided up between Strom Thurmond and another third-party candidate. So, give him hell, Harry wins outright on his own and is going to be president for the next 4 years. Now, the next thing we want to talk about in this time period is one theme we've been hitting on off and on since our examination of World War II is the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, some other factors are going to play into this that I want to remind you of. Besides the Cold War just simply being between us and the Soviets, in 1949, a revolution happens in China, and the communist leader, Mao Zedong, takes over in China. Now, this sort of creates a situation where now we have a Cold War with the Soviets and the Chinese. But it's not that simple. The Soviets and the Chinese have never, ever got along. They may both be communist nations, but it doesn't mean they're allies and best friends. But it doesn't mean either of them like the United States. But it's not like many believed was going to be the case. They're not going to team up against us. And in fact, later on, especially President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger will use this long-term animosity between the Soviets and the Chinese to the U.S. advantage when Nixon goes and visits China in the 70s, opens up relations, and it's really a blow to the Soviet Union. Now, so if we take a look on page 836, the Cold War is finally going to really ignite, so to speak, when the Korean War begins in 1950. North Korea has become communist and allied themselves with China, their neighbors to the north, And the South Koreans were resisting this communist revolution. So it's going to turn into a war between communist North Korea and the democratic South Korea. Now, this war will really heat up in June of 1950, and it'll be the real first test of the brand new organization that was created in the post-war world, the United Nations. And it will end up being the United Nations' first police action. And the United Nations will send troops to the Korean Peninsula, led by the United States and one of our top generals from World War II, General Douglas MacArthur. And the Korean War will unfold. Now, this is not an official war. The United States does not declare war on North Korea or China, even though MacArthur certainly wanted to declare war on China. It's a UN police action. And this is one thing that I want to emphasize to you today. The last time the United States declared war on another country was World War II, when we declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. Every conflict since then has been what's known as a police action. No formal declarations of war, period. Now, this includes Korea, Vietnam, the two Gulf Wars, and so on. So, we haven't had an official declared war since we declared war in December of 1941. And quite frankly, we're lucky because the federal government takes on extraordinary powers during a declared war and can limit our civil liberties and rights. So, the Korean War is a pretty bloody, horrible situation, and it will drag on until, the mid-50s almost, to 1953 anyway, and it'll certainly dominate Truman's term in the White House. So, what we want to move on to next here, and this moves us into the next chapter, chapter 35, we want to talk about the election of 1952. Now, Harry S. Truman, even though he could have run for another term, because he only had been elected once, decided against it, and it creates a wide-open presidential election. So the Republicans are going to recruit the real hero of World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commonly known as Ike. Now, he was the supreme commander of Allied forces during World War II. He was the mastermind of D-Day, and he's sort of similar to Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War. If you want to point to one person who was the real big, true hero that was a general, I know there were other major generals like Patton and MacArthur and whatnot, but Eisenhower was the man. Now, the Democrats are going to nominate the governor of the state of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. Now, the most controversial part of this election is going to be the person that Ike or Eisenhower selects as vice president, Richard M. Nixon. Nixon is going to be accused of taking illegal gifts as a congressman, and he's going to have to make a famous speech to the American public on TV, one of the first, televised national speeches like this, because remember, TV is just a brand new thing that's coming into Americans' homes in the 1950s. He makes the famous Checkers speech. Now, the reason why it's called Checkers is because that's the Nixon family's Cocker Spaniel. He was given to the family by by a lobbyist. And this was not reported as a gift, and it violated, lobbyist laws and so forth. So Nixon appeared with his family and the dog on the couch in the living room. You can look this up on YouTube. The famous Checkers speech is available. And he basically admits, yes, I should have reported this as a gift. I probably shouldn't have accepted it. But by God, I'm not giving Checkers back. My daughters love this dog, so be it. And this speech won over the hearts and minds of Americans. Because if you're like me and you're a dog lover, you'd feel the same way. Yeah, you didn't exactly do this the correct way, but by God, I'm not giving back Checkers because he's supposedly illegal. So Eisenhower will prevail in this election. He'll receive almost 34 million votes to Adlai Stevenson's 27. It's a landslide victory. But it shouldn't surprise anyone. Eisenhower was a real war hero. So, what we want to talk about next, you can see the results of the 52 election in your textbook on page 859. You have the election map there. You also have a photograph of Korea still dragging on in 1952, unfortunately. But the next big thing that's going to dominate American society is going to be desegregation. Now, what had happened, as you'll remember, and we talked about this, after the Republicans sort of sold out with the Compromise of 1877 and gave the South back to white Southern Democrats, outright segregation will be instituted. We talked about how ridiculous Plessy versus Ferguson was. In my mind, the worst decision the Supreme Court has ever made in its history. And with that state-sponsored segregation that started on trains in Louisiana, as I mentioned before, it's going to spread throughout society. And they're going to separate the races, and the laws that separate races, or segregation laws, are commonly known as Jim Crow laws. Then at the turn of the 20th century, this was magnified by the horrible violence of lynchings that went on, which led to our old pal, W.E.B. Du Bois, founding the NAACP and the Niagara movement. And that's going to start setting the stage, the actions of the NAACP and the writings of Du Bois towards desegregation. Now, it's really going to start to emerge in the late 40s. And here's a few things that really push our society along to dismiss this unequal treatment of people, the segregation of the races. And the one thing will be World War II. Even though troops were technically segregated, once you got to a battlefield situation, that just gets thrown to the wind. And black and white soldiers fought very valiantly, and when they returned from the battlefields of Asia and Europe, one thing that really ticked off some African-American veterans was the fact that they were all eligible for the benefits of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights, which I explained to you later, and obviously pointed out how I believe it's probably the most significant piece of legislation ever passed. The area where black veterans were definitely discriminated against was, first of all, it allowed people to go to college if they wanted to. There were a lot of colleges and universities, especially in the South, that did not allow black students to attend, like the University of Mississippi. So, if you wanted to go to college in many cases, you were forced to go to an all-black college or to a college in the North that would allow, that wasn't segregated. Also, the other problem that black veterans suffered through and really magnified this horrendous segregated society we lived in was getting VA loans to buy brand new homes. All these suburbs popped up outside of cities, but unfortunately, they were segregated, even in the North. So, for example, if a black veteran wanted to purchase a home in Levittown, one of the first suburbs in America, they weren't able to. The owners of Levittown would not sell to African Americans, even though these were veterans eligible for the same loans through the VA that all the white veterans were that were buying these homes. They were shut out. And this really made a lot of them become very active members of the civil rights movement because their blood on the battlefield was the same damn color as the white soldiers' blood, but they're being treated very differently when they get back to the United States. So, some other things that we want to point out that's going to lead to this desegregation is there's going to be some Supreme Court cases that make it to the U.S. Supreme Court in the late 40s, challenging the segregation of colleges and universities. And that's going to be the first area where the Supreme Court starts to desegregate. And there's going to be cases where specifically suits are filed against segregated law schools in Missouri and Texas, and the United States Supreme Court will rule them unconstitutional and that they must desegregate. Now, one of the key figures in all this that I mentioned before that's going to be a major player is Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice appointed by Woodrow Wilson. He was very young when he was appointed, and he's still on the court, and he's writing some of the majority opinions to desegregate institutions of higher education. So that very important appointment will become quite, even more important as time goes on. Now, some of the other things that we want to point out, and they show you there's photographs and whatnot in the textbook. A horrible event happens in the summer of 1955 when a young teenage boy by the name of Emmett Till is visiting his grandma down in the state of Mississippi, if memory serves me correctly. And because he whistled at a white woman when he was standing outside of a convenience store, what it amounted to, he is going to be dragged out of his home and brutally murdered for this supposed egregious action by him. He came from Chicago. In Chicago, the races weren't segregated like they were in the Deep South, and he was just acting as a normal teenage boy, and it ended up costing him his life. This horrible murder is going to make front page news. Very graphic photographs of his beaten body laying in a casket will appear in major magazines like Life and Look and Time. And America will become aware of this horrible divide that exists in America. Now, another thing that's going to really change everything, and it happened actually the year before Emmett Till's murder, was the landmark Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, rendered in 1954 by the Warren Court. Chief Justice Earl Warren was in charge of the court at this point. A case is brought forward challenging the segregated school system that existed in Topeka, Kansas. And in this case, the Supreme Court agreed to hear it, and the chief litigator that represented the Brown family in the courtroom was the famous Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall had risen through the ranks. He's a university, he's a Howard University law grad. He became the chief litigator for the NAACP, and he put together a masterminded argument in front of the Supreme Court to get them to desegregate schools once and for all. And thus, what this case will really do is overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, in this case, another key player besides Thurgood Marshall, which, by the way, I'm sure you've heard of him before, Thurgood Marshall will be such a great litigator for the NAACP. Many people don't realize that he argued 24 cases in front of the United States Supreme Court, which is an accomplishment in itself. Attorneys, if they get to argue one case in front of the United States Supreme Court, it gives them bragging rights over 99% of their colleagues. He argued 24. He was 24-0 in his decisions. He won every single case. This is going to make him one of the most brilliant legal minds in the country. And in the 1960s, when an opening comes up on the United States Supreme Court, President Lyndon Johnson will appoint Thurgood Marshall to be the first ever African-American Supreme Court justice. And he'll serve a long, illustrious career on the court and be one of our greatest justices. So, Thurgood Marshall is certainly a big player in the civil rights movement. Now, the court will, I don't want to get into the legal arguments and so forth of Brown versus the Board of Education. They're pretty complex, but the bottom line is Chief Justice Earl Warren lobbied behind the scenes, got the court to make a unanimous decision, 9-0, ruling in favor of desegregation of public schools in America because he knew this was going to be such a monumental decision. And the court had to come out united. So, thanks to Warren and Thurgood Marshall, Brown versus the Board of Education is going to be a landmark decision. It's going to take quite some time to implement it across the country, but it's the beginning. The very next year, we're going to see this start to really take hold in America when Rosa Parks down in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to give up her seat on a bus to a white person. Now, according to the rules down in the South, white people got priority on the Montgomery City buses. And if all the seats filled up and a white person came on the bus and you were a black person sitting in a seat, you were supposed to get up and surrender your seat to that white person and stand for the rest of the bus ride. Now, Rosa Parks refused to do this. She's going to be arrested for violating the laws of Montgomery, Alabama. Now, later on, she'll, reveal the real reason why she didn't give up her seat was not that she was some sort of civil rights advocate at the time, which she'll become a pioneer of the civil rights movement and a symbolic person in it, was that she was a maid. She had worked a long, hard day, and her feet hurt too much to stand up. So by God, she wasn't going to stand up. And can anyone blame her? So she will start the Montgomery bus boycott, and very quickly, the gentleman who is pictured on page 864, Dr. Martin Luther King, will emerge as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, which will drag on for a whole year. Finally, the city of Montgomery, Alabama will bend to the boycott and desegregate buses in their city. Now, another big turning point for the civil rights movement that happens in the 1950s happens in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, let me find the picture here for you. I don't put these in chronological order, unfortunately. If you look at page 861 in your book, there's a famous photograph of 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford walking to school in Little Rock, Arkansas. So let me tell you a little bit about this situation. Supreme Court ruled public schools need to be desegregated. Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas had been an all-white high school forever. The Little Rock Nine, which were 9 very brave African-American high school kids, one of which is Elizabeth Eckford pictured here, register for classes, and they're going to go to class at all-white Central High School in Little Rock. Now, people in Little Rock, white people, were furious. And adults, as you can see, gathered to protest these 9 brave kids going to school at the all-white high school. Horrible, jeering was made towards these kids. Horrible insults from adults, no less. And what's going to happen here is President Eisenhower gets put on the spot, and he's got to make a decision because the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, calls in the National Guard to line up on the front steps of Little Rock High School and deny access to these 9 black teenagers. So what Eisenhower does, because here's a state defying the Supreme Court order of desegregation, he will order in the United States Army to escort these 9 teenagers to school every day and push the National Guard out of the way and bring these kids into the high school. The National Guard will then obviously fall back. They're not going to get into a battle with the United States Army. But every day through that entire school year, the United States Army escorts these 9 brave kids to high school. Now, what goes on behind the scenes in a high school and the jeering and the ribbing, and you know what high school kids are like. These 9 teenagers are heroes. And they did it, and they made it through the year, and some of them will graduate. So, the Little Rock Nine really put desegregation to the test, and thank goodness President Eisenhower came through and backed it up. He didn't have to do that, but by God, he was a good man, and he did it. So, your book also talks about some of the other leading forces in the civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or the SCLC as they're known, and then black college kids who formed their own organization and did such things as lunch counter sit-ins and so forth. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, SNCC. The activities of these groups, combined with Dr. Martin Luther King and others, is going to be a heroic movement that ultimately, and once and for all, by the time we get to the 60s, will desegregate our society. So, that's where I'm going to call her quits for today. And I believe I'm just going to end the semester here. I could go on and we could talk about the rest of the Eisenhower administration. We could go on and talk about Kennedy and so forth. but I really didn't pose any questions about those on your final exam. And, we're running out of time, and you don't really care about hearing about that anyway. You're going to concentrate on writing excellent final exams with the questions I already posed to you. But I wanted to make sure and cover the early civil rights movement and what happened then, including the trials and tribulations of Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and so forth, because it's extremely important for you to know about. And if any of you end up being American history majors, you'll be able to take classes at major universities that you go to just on the civil rights movement. I know I took a whole semester class in the civil rights movement. It was one of the greatest classes I ever took, and I'd encourage you to do so. So, that's it for this semester class. I thank you for being patient with me as I work my way through this transition. I really kind of like this recording a lecture mode, and I'm going to end up recording both my classes, all the lectures this summer, so I have a total package for the future, because I don't know what the future holds. And thank you very much. I hope that you all have a healthy and safe summer. It's been my pleasure to teach you guys this semester through this very trying time, and we're going to get through it, and you're all going to complete your degrees at Clinton, and you're going to go on to greatness at the universities that you select in the future. Don't be discouraged by this. You can all do it, and you will do it, and you'll thank yourselves later. So, be healthy, be safe, take care. Bye now.